Rain slicked the asphalt of Route 9, masking the scent of stale fry grease bleeding from the diner's exhaust vents. Inside, a billionaire sat hunched over burnt coffee running from a boardroom coup he barely survived. A waitress slid a stained receipt onto his formica table. Blue ink bled into the cheap paper. A phone number, he assumed. A tired cliché. Then his eyes locked on the digits and the cold reality stopped his breathing. Thomas Whitmire hated the smell of bleach. It never quite masked the decay beneath it. It only added a chemical sharpness to the rot. Here inside the fluorescent purgatory of the Crossroads Diner, the bleach waged a losing war against 50 years of accumulated bacon grease, spilled beer, and wet wool. He shifted his weight on the cracked vinyl booth. The material sighed, releasing a puff of dusty air that smelled faintly of old cigarettes. Thomas was a man accustomed to the silent, frictionless embrace of bespoke leather seating and climate-controlled environments. His current reality, a drenched $3,000 charcoal suit clinging to his shivering frame, was a grotesque departure from the norm. He dragged a damp hand down his face, feeling the rough stubble that had sprouted along his jawline over the last 14 hours. 14 hours since he had sprinted down the emergency stairwell of Whitmire Holdings. 14 hours since he realized his chief financial officer, Miller, hadn't just been cooking the books. He had been funding a private security apparatus that answered to no one. Thomas stared down at the chipped ceramic mug in front of him. The coffee inside was black, stagnant, and possessed the iridescent, oily sheen of a roadside puddle. He didn't drink it. He just wrapped his trembling, cold fingers around the warm porcelain, anchoring himself to the physical world. He was safe here. That was the lie he kept repeating, a mantra looping in the chaotic theater of his mind. He was 3 hours north of the city, sitting in a diner that didn't even register on modern GPS maps. He had abandoned his tracked Maybach under an overpass, trading it for a gray rented Ford Taurus bought with cash from a sleepy teenager at a used lot. He had snapped his SIM card, tossed his phone into a storm drain, and driven blindly into the deluge. A shadow fell over his table. Thomas flinched, his right hand twitching toward a weapon he didn't possess. "More coffee, hon?" It was the waitress. Her name tag, crooked and pinned to a faded pink uniform, read Jess. She looked to be in her late 20s, though the harsh overhead lighting carved exhausted shadows under her eyes, aging her prematurely. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, smelling faintly of cheap coconut shampoo and lingering fryer oil. She held a glass carafe with a burnt orange rim, her posture slumped with the weight of a 12-hour shift. "No," Thomas said, his voice cracking. It sounded foreign to him, hollow-stripped of the booming boardroom authority he had spent decades cultivating. "No, thank you, just the check." Jess didn't smile. She didn't offer a platitude. She just gave a slow, apathetic nod, the universal gesture of the chronically overworked. "Sure thing. I'll print it up." She shuffled away her rubber-soled sneakers, squeaking rhythmically against the linoleum floor. Thomas watched her go, his paranoid mind dissecting her every movement. Was her gait natural? Did she look back at him too long? Was she wearing an earpiece beneath that messy hair? "Stop it!" he berated himself, squeezing his eyes shut. The headache blooming at the base of his skull throbbed in time with his racing heart. "You're losing your grip, Whitmire." He opened his eyes and forced himself to observe his surroundings objectively. The diner was nearly empty. In the far corner, an elderly man methodically cut a stack of pancakes into perfect symmetrical squares. At the counter, a truck driver in a high-visibility jacket stared vacantly at a muted television screen playing a local news broadcast. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigeration units, the rhythmic hum of the rain hammering against the plate glass windows, and the sizzle of meat on a flat-top grill in the back. It was utterly painfully ordinary. A slice of forgotten Americana. Nobody here cared about corporate espionage, offshore shell companies, or the fact that Thomas Whitmire's net worth was equivalent to the GDP of a small island nation. Here he was, just another tired man, avoiding the storm. He reached into his inner suit pocket, wincing as the damp fabric clung to his skin. He pulled out a sleek titanium money clip, the only vestige of his former life he had kept. It held a thick fold of $100 bills. He peeled one off, smoothing the crisp paper against the sticky surface of the table. He intended to overpay. He wanted to leave quietly, slip back out into the rain and drive until he hit the Canadian border. He closed his eyes again, trying to regulate his breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. A grounding technique his therapist had taught him years ago, back when his biggest stressor was a hostile takeover of a tech startup, not a literal hit squad. The squeak of rubber soles returned. "Here you go," Jess muttered, her voice flat. Thomas opened his eyes. She dropped a small rectangular black plastic tray onto the table. A white receipt lay face down inside it. Before Thomas could speak, she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the swinging metal doors that led to the kitchen. Thomas exhaled a shaky breath. He reached for the tray, his fingers brushing the cheap, damp paper. He flipped the receipt over to look at the total. He expected to see a meager sum. $7 for the grilled cheese he took 2 bites of, $3 for the coffee. Instead, he saw something that made the ambient noise of the diner vanish into a deafening, ringing silence. Scrawled across the bottom of the receipt, right beneath the printed "Thank you, please come again," were numbers written in bright blue, heavy-inked ballpoint pen. At first glance, it looked like a phone number, a 10-digit sequence. A deeply cynical, almost hysterical laugh bubbled in the back of Thomas's throat. A waitress hitting on him. Here, at the end of his life, smelling like wet dog, and fear a waitress was slipping him her number. It was so pathetic, so tragically human, that it almost broke the tension winding around his spine. But Thomas was a man of numbers. He didn't just read digits. He absorbed them. He processed sequences, margins, and probabilities with the involuntary ease of a man breathing air. He looked closer. The blue ink was thick, pooling slightly at the edges of the numbers where the pen had pressed too hard into the paper. SN8842219B. The hysterical laugh died in his throat. It didn't fade. It was abruptly, violently strangled by a cold wave of pure, paralyzing terror. The diner around him ceased to exist. The smell of bleach evaporated. The hum of the refrigerator faded into a muted underwater distortion. The only thing in the universe was that sequence of alphanumeric characters screaming at him from the grease-stained paper. It wasn't a phone number. It wasn't a bank routing sequence. It wasn't a vault combination. It was a serial number. Specifically, it was the serial number of the dual-chamber titanium pacemaker surgically implanted beneath the pectoral muscle of his left chest. Thomas's right hand flew to his chest, his fingers digging into the wet fabric of his shirt. Pressing against the firm, slightly raised scar tissue just below his collarbone, he could feel the faint, rhythmic, mechanical pulse against his fingertips. Thump, thump, thump. His breathing turned shallow, rapid. He couldn't get enough oxygen. The air in the diner suddenly felt thick, heavy, unbreathable. How? The question echoed in the hollow cavity of his skull. Only 3 entities in the world possessed that specific sequence. His lead cardiologist at Mount Sinai, the encrypted medical file housed on Whitmire Holdings' secure private server, and Thomas himself. To anyone else, it was gibberish. To Miller and the men hunting him, it was a leash. Modern pacemakers weren't just mechanical metronomes, they were wireless nodes. They transmitted telemetry data via Bluetooth to a patient's smartphone, allowing doctors to monitor battery life, detect arrhythmias, and track cardiac events in real time. Thomas had explicitly ordered his security team to disable the remote broadcasting feature, paranoid about exactly this kind of vulnerability. But Miller had compromised his security team. Thomas stared at the blue ink. The implication hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't tracked the Maybach. They hadn't traced his phone. They hadn't used facial recognition on highway toll cameras. They were tracking his heart. Every beat, every spike of adrenaline, every frightened palpitation was pinging a satellite, drawing a bright red target directly onto his chest. Nausea rolled through his stomach, a hot acidic wave that tasted like copper and old coffee. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the sticky table, burying his face in his hands. His meticulously constructed illusion of safety shattered, leaving him entirely exposed. He forced himself to look up. He needed to find Jess. He scanned the diner, his eyes wild, darting past the old man with the pancakes past the trucker. The swinging metal doors to the kitchen were still. Had she known what she was writing, Thomas replayed her approach in his mind, her slumped shoulders, her flat voice. She hadn't looked him in the eye when she dropped the tray. Her hands? Had her hands been shaking? He couldn't remember. He had been too focused on his own misery to notice hers. Someone had given her that message. Someone had walked into this diner, handed her a $20 bill and said, "Write this on the guy in the booth's check." Which meant they were already here. This wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of total dominance. It was Miller's way of saying, you can run into the dark, Thomas, but we can see the light inside your chest. Panic, raw and unfiltered, clawed its way up his throat. He wasn't John Wick. He wasn't a trained operative. He was a 58-year-old man who got winded, climbing 2 flights of stairs, a man whose only real weapons were injunctions, hostile takeovers, and armies of lawyers. None of those could save him from a bullet in a parking lot. He looked at the $100 bill still resting on the table. He grabbed at his fingers, fumbling clumsily, and threw it onto the plastic tray. He didn't care about the change. He didn't care about the receipt. He slid out of the booth. His legs felt like lead disconnected from his brain. His knee banged painfully against the underside of the table, rattling the coffee cup, but he barely felt it. He had to move. If they were playing games with receipts, they were taking their time. They were enjoying the hunt. That arrogance was a window, a tiny, rapidly closing window of opportunity. He staggered toward the exit, his wet leather shoes slipping slightly on the linoleum. Every shadow in the diner suddenly looked menacing. The trucker at the counter shifted his weight. Thomas froze. His heart slamming against his ribs. They can see my heart rate spiking, but the trucker merely reached for the salt shaker. Thomas reached the glass double doors at the front. He pushed through the cheerful, mocking chime of the bell above the door, ringing out behind him. He stepped back out into the night. The transition from the stale, stagnant warmth of the diner to the biting, wet chill of the outside world was a violent shock to his system. The rain had intensified, falling in thick, heavy sheets that stung his face and instantly soaked through the thin barrier of his ruined suit jacket. The parking lot was a sprawling expanse of cracked asphalt and muddy gravel, illuminated by a single flickering sodium vapor street lamp that cast a sickly, jaundiced yellow glow over the area. Thomas stood beneath the diner's small, rusted awning, gasping for air. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the pines bordering the highway, sounding like a chorus of low, mocking voices. He scanned the lot. There were only 3 vehicles: a massive, idling 18-wheeler belonging to the trucker, a rusted early 2000s Honda Civic that likely belonged to Jess or the cook, and his rented gray Ford Taurus parked at the far edge of the lot near the tree line. No black SUVs, no idling sedans with tinted windows. The absence of a visible threat didn't calm him. It amplified his terror. They were professionals. They wouldn't park under the only streetlight. They would be in the shadows. They would be in the trees. He looked toward the dark expanse of the woods bordering the lot, his eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. The rain distorted everything, turning the swaying branches into creeping figures. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a pinprick of orange light in the darkness, a cigarette cherry, a sniper's laser. He blinked, wiping the rain and cold sweat from his eyes, and the light was gone. Just a trick of the exhausted mind or a ghost in the machine. He had to get to the car. He stepped out from under the awning. The rain hit him like a physical weight. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his fingers frantically searching for the rental car keys. His knuckles brushed against the cold metal of the key ring. He pulled them out, but his hands were shaking so violently that his grip failed. The keys slipped from his fingers. They hit the asphalt with a sharp, pathetic clatter, bouncing off a rock and plunging into a deep puddle of muddy water near his feet. God damn it! Thomas hissed a pathetic, broken sound. He dropped to his knees. The sharp gravel bit through the wet fabric of his trousers, tearing the skin of his kneecaps. He plunged his bare hands into the freezing, oily puddle, frantically sweeping his fingers across the rough bottom. The water numbed his skin instantly. He scraped his knuckles against a piece of broken glass, feeling the warm sting of a fresh cut, but he didn't stop. Pathetic. The word echoed in his mind, the great Thomas Whitmire groveling in the mud for a piece of cheap metal. His fingers brushed against the plastic fob. He grabbed it. Clutching it so tightly, the plastic dug into his palm. He pushed himself up his suit, now coated in a thick layer of grit and mud. He half ran, half limped toward the Taurus. Every step felt like a mile. The distance stretched, the car seemingly retreating further into the shadows the closer he got. He kept expecting the crack of a suppressed rifle. He kept expecting his chest to explode outward, ruining the titanium device that had betrayed him. He reached the driver's side door. He jammed the key into the lock. The rental was too old and basic for keyless entry and twisted. The lock mechanism clunked heavily. He yanked the door open and threw himself inside, slamming the heavy steel shut behind him. The interior of the Taurus smelled faintly of artificial vanilla air freshener and old dust. It was cold, but it blocked out the wind and the deafening roar of the rain. Thomas leaned his head back against the cheap fabric headrest, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was completely drenched, shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering with a loud clicking rhythm. He lifted his trembling right hand and stared at the key. Start the car. Put it in drive. Go. It was a simple instruction, but his brain refused to send the signal to his arm. He stared at the steering column. If they knew his pacemaker's telemetry, if they could track his heart, if they could get a waitress to write a message on his bill, why hadn't they killed him when he walked out of the diner? Thomas's eyes widened. The realization bloomed in his chest, colder than the rain. They didn't want to shoot him in a parking lot. That was messy. That required cleanup. A billionaire found shot to death at a roadside diner sparked federal investigations. Senate hearings, endless media scrutiny. But a grieving, paranoid billionaire fleeing a corporate scandal, driving frantically in a massive storm, losing control of his vehicle, and wrapping it around a pine tree, that was a tragedy. That was an accident. He looked down at the ignition slot. Did they wire the car? Was the explosive wired to the starter? Or did they tamper with the brake lines? If he turned the key, would the vehicle detonate instantly, turning the gray Taurus into a fireball that the rain would quickly extinguish? He sat frozen in the driver's seat, trapped in a paralyzing paradox. If he stayed in the car, he was a sitting duck, waiting for them to grow impatient and approach the glass. If he turned the key, he might be triggering his own execution. He looked at the rearview mirror. Through the rain-streaked rear window illuminated by the distant flickering street lamp, he saw a shape detach itself from the shadows of the tree line. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a man. The figure wore a dark, heavy rain slicker. He wasn't running. He wasn't rushing. He was walking with a slow, measured, terrifyingly calm cadence across the gravel lot, heading directly toward the rear bumper of the Taurus. Thomas felt the titanium device beneath his skin throb. Thump, 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 thump. They were watching his pulse spike. They knew exactly how terrified he was. He looked back at the key in his bloody, mud-caked hand. He had to make a choice. Die waiting or risk dying fighting. Thomas clenched his jaw, sliding the key into the ignition. Breath seized in his throat as he twisted the key. The cheap plastic of the fob creaked under the desperate pressure of his grip. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The silence in the cabin was an absolute vacuum. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the concussive heat of expanding gas, the shattering of glass, the violent end to his 58 years. Instead, the starter motor whined a pathetic, straining screech, and the four-cylinder engine sputtered to life. The entire chassis of the Ford Taurus shuddered, settling into a rough, uneven idle. Thomas ripped his eyes open. He was alive. The air smelled of damp wool and artificial vanilla, not sulfur. He didn't have time to exhale. In the rearview mirror, the figure in the rain slicker was no longer walking. He was sprinting. The man moved with a terrifying fluid efficiency, his boots kicking up fans of muddy water as he closed the gap to the rear bumper. As he ran, the man reached beneath the dark plastic of his coat, pulling free something matte black and heavy. Thomas slammed the gear shift down into reverse. The transmission clunked violently, resisting the sudden abusive change. He stomped on the gas pedal. The front tires, slick with mud, spun uselessly for an agonizing second, whining against the asphalt. Then the rubber caught a patch of dry gravel beneath the puddle. The Taurus jerked backward with neck-snapping force. A heavy, wet thud reverberated through the trunk. Thomas whipped his head around. He had clipped the man. The figure spun off the rear quarter panel, slipping on the wet tarmac and going down hard onto one knee. The matte black objects, a suppressed handgun, skittered across the gravel, splashing into a puddle out of reach. "Stay down," Thomas gasped, a hysterical, breathless command to an empty car. He shoved the shifter into drive, wrenching the steering wheel hard to the left. The Taurus lurched forward, fishtailing wildly. The rear passenger side tire caught the edge of a deep pothole, sending a jarring impact straight up Thomas's spine. He didn't lift his foot off the accelerator. He kept it pinned to the floor mat, wrestling the steering wheel as the heavy sedan slid onto the paved surface of Route 9. The wiper blades slapped frantically against the windshield, struggling to clear the sheets of driving rain. Thomas leaned over the steering wheel, his chest heaving, his mouth hanging open as he sucked in ragged, desperate breaths. His wet clothes clung to him like a second skin, freezing against the sudden blast of the car's failing heater. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The highway behind him was a wall of blackness and rain. No headlights, no pursuit. He had escaped the parking lot. But the cold knot in his stomach tightened. SN8, 84219B. The alphanumeric sequence flashed behind his eyes, a neon sign in the dark. He pressed his muddy, bloody palm flat against the left side of his chest. Beneath the soaked fabric of his shirt, the titanium box was ticking, pinging, broadcasting his exact physiological state to a server hundreds of miles away. His analytical mind, sharpened by decades of ruthless corporate maneuvering, began to tear through the panic, searching for the logic in the snare. How were they tracking it in real time? Modern pacemakers utilized low-energy Bluetooth. The transmission range was pitiful. 30, maybe 40 feet in optimal, unobstructed conditions. It wasn't a GPS tracker. It couldn't ping a satellite directly from his chest cavity. It needed a bridge. It needed a secondary device to catch the Bluetooth signal and push it out to the cellular network. His phone. But He had destroyed his iPhone. He had snapped the logic board and kicked it down a storm drain in a Wendy's parking lot 6 hours ago. So how did Miller's men know he was at the Crossroads Diner? Thomas's eyes darted around the dark cabin of the Taurus. They swept over the cracked leather of the steering wheel, the faded plastic vents, and then landed on the center console. The car's infotainment screen was glowing a dull, unearthly blue in the dark. A message was scrolling across the cracked LCD display. Searching for devices. Sync_failed. Searching for devices. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Rental cars. Thousands of people sync their phones, their tablets, their lives to these rolling computers and never wipe the data when they return the keys. The Taurus had a built-in cellular modem for its emergency SOS system and navigation. Miller's team hadn't hacked the pacemaker directly. They had hacked the rental company's fleet network. They pinged the cellular modem in the car, remotely activated the vehicle's Bluetooth receiver, and commanded it to sweep for his specific pacemaker signature. Once he got into the car, his own heart had shaken hands with the dashboard, broadcasting his location to the world. He was driving his own tracking beacon. "No," Thomas whispered. "No, no, no." He reached out his trembling fingers, jabbing wildly at the physical buttons flanking the screen. Radio, media, phone, setup. He mashed them, trying to force the system to power down. The screen flickered, froze, and then stubbornly resumed its search, searching for devices. He needed to kill the battery. He needed to stop the car, but if he stopped the car, the men in the dark would catch up. He looked in the rearview mirror again. A pair of xenon headlights had appeared in the gloom rounding a curve a mile back. They were bright, aggressive, and moving much faster than the speed limit. Panic, hot and blinding, flared in his throat. He swerved slightly, the Taurus drifting over the yellow line before he overcorrected, the tires squealing against the wet asphalt. He couldn't outrun them in a 4-cylinder rental. He had to kill the beacon. Thomas reached across the passenger seat, his fingers fumbling with the latch of the glove box. He yanked it open. A cascade of paper napkins, old toll receipts, and a worn owner's manual spilled onto the floorboard. He dug his hand into the dark plastic cavity, searching blindly. His fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. A flashlight, a heavy anodized aluminum mag light left behind by a previous driver. He gripped the knurled handle and hauled it out. It was heavy, nearly 2 pounds of solid metal. He didn't hesitate. He swung the flashlight like a hammer, bringing the heavy bulbous end down in a brutal arc. The impact sounded like a gunshot inside the small cabin. The plastic screen of the infotainment system cracked, a starburst of shattered LCD blooming across the display. Thomas swung again and again. He was screaming now, a primal wordless sound of rage and terror. He smashed the flashlight into the console until the plastic housing caved in, exposing the green, delicate circuit boards beneath. Sparks showered over his lap, smelling of ozone and burning plastic. The blue glow flickered violently, then died. The cabin was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the pale, sweeping glow of his own headlights. He dropped the flashlight onto the passenger seat, gasping. His right hand throbbed. He had sliced his knuckles on the jagged plastic, and warm blood was running down his fingers, dripping onto his trousers. He looked at the rearview mirror. The xenon headlights were still there, and they were closer. Smashing the screen wasn't enough. The Bluetooth receiver might be dead, but the car's GPS modem was likely buried somewhere else behind the dashboard, under the rear seats. As long as the battery was connected, the car was bleeding his location onto a map. He had to ditch the vehicle. Route 9 was desolate, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, unyielding pine forests. There were no exits, no gas stations, no strip malls to disappear into, just an endless corridor of trees that looked like black, jagged teeth against the dark gray sky. The headlights in the mirror were less than a quarter-mile behind him now. They didn't have police flashers. They were just 2 blinding white eyes, steady and relentless. Up ahead, his high beams caught a break in the tree line. A narrow, unpaved logging road jutted off to the right, barely visible through the torrential rain. It was a steep decline choked with overgrown brush and deep ruts. It was a terrible choice. It was the only choice. Thomas slammed on the brakes. The Taurus's anti-lock system engaged the pedal, vibrating violently against his foot as the heavy sedan skidded across the wet pavement. He wrenched the steering wheel to the right. The car plunged off the asphalt and hit the mud. The transition was violent. The Taurus bottomed out immediately, the undercarriage scraping against a hidden rock with a deafening metallic shriek. Thomas was thrown forward against the seatbelt, the nylon strap biting painfully into his collarbone. The car bounced down the steep, deeply rutted path, the headlights illuminating a chaotic tunnel of wet, whipping branches. Pine needles and thorns scraped along the side panels, sounding like fingernails on a chalkboard. Come on," he muttered, fighting the wheel as the car slid uncontrollably. He reached the bottom of the incline 50 yards off the main road. The front tires plunged into a deep, waterlogged trench. The engine bogged down, choking on the sudden resistance. Thomas slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun uselessly, throwing a massive rooster tail of thick red clay into the air, but the chassis didn't move an inch. He was high-centered. The car was stuck. Thomas threw the shifter into park and killed the ignition. The sudden silence was crushing. The roar of the engine was replaced by the deafening drum of the rain against the roof and the hiss of steam rising from the hot hood. He sat in the dark, his hands glued to the steering wheel, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. He looked over his shoulder out the rear window. The logging trail was a black void. He waited for the sweeping beams of the xenon headlights to follow him down the incline. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. A flash of white light illuminated the tops of the trees near the highway above him. The SUV had passed the entrance to the logging road. They hadn't seen him turn off. Thomas closed his eyes, letting his head drop against the steering wheel. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel relief. Then his chest pulsed. Thump, thump. His eyes snapped open. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating dread. The car's modem might be damaged, and he might have temporarily blinded them, but he was still wearing the pacemaker. If he got out of this car and walked into a town, if he passed a coffee shop with public Wi-Fi, if he walked past someone with an active smartwatch, his pacemaker would reach out, ping the nearest network, and scream his location again. He was a walking liability. He couldn't go to a hospital to have it removed. They'd be watching the medical databases. He couldn't cut it out himself. He'd bleed to death in minutes. He needed to silence the device. Completely. He dug his fingernails into his palms, forcing his mind to go back to the sterile, air-conditioned office of Dr. Kensington at Mount Sinai 3 years ago. It's a magnificent piece of technology, Thomas Kensington had said, tapping a stylus against a tablet, but it has its quirks. You need to avoid heavy industrial machinery. MRI machines are obviously out of the question. Strong magnetic fields disrupt the telemetry. If you get too close to a powerful magnet, the safety relay trips. It shuts off all the auxiliary functions, the Bluetooth, the remote monitoring, and defaults to a fixed asynchronous pacing. 65 beats per minute. It'll keep you alive, but it will feel like you're walking through wet cement. A magnet. He needed a strong, heavy magnet. Thomas looked around the dark, cramped interior of the Taurus. He was sitting in a metal box filled with cheap plastic. Where the hell was he going to find a magnet? His eyes stopped on the lower corner of the driver's side door panel. Behind the perforated gray plastic grid was a 6-inch audio speaker. Speakers functioned using an electromagnetic coil and a heavy permanent ceramic magnet. Thomas grabbed the heavy mag light from the passenger seat. He clicked the rubber button on the tail cap. The beam was weak and flickering. He had damaged the internal connections when he smashed the console, but it was enough. He wedged the flashlight under his arm, angling the beam down toward the door panel. He didn't have tools. He only had his hands. He wedged his bloodied fingers into the tight seam where the plastic panel met the metal door frame. He pulled. The plastic flexed, but the heavy-duty retaining clips held firm. He gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip. He hooked his index and middle fingers behind the thickest part of the plastic armrest and braced his muddy boot against the door hinge. He hauled back with everything he had. A sharp, agonizing tear ripped through his right hand. His index fingernail caught on a hidden metal flange and peeled backward, tearing deeply into the nail bed. Thomas let out a short, guttural scream, falling back against the driver's seat. He grabbed his right wrist, squeezing tightly as white-hot pain flared up his forearm. He looked at his hand in the flickering beam of the flashlight. Blood was welling rapidly from the torn nail, hot and sticky, dripping onto his trousers. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a wave of nausea. He wanted to quit. He wanted to sit in the dark, bleed, and wait for them to find him. It would be so easy to just stop fighting. They can see the light inside your chest. The thought acted like a shot of adrenaline. He forced his eyes open. He wiped the blood on his slacks, his breathing ragged. He grabbed the heavy metal body of the mag light. Instead of pulling, he used the flashlight as a pry bar. He shoved the flat, heavy tail cap into the seam near the bottom of the door, right next to the speaker grill. He leaned his entire body weight against the aluminum tube. With a loud, violent crack, 3 of the plastic retaining clips snapped simultaneously. The bottom half of the door panel tore away from the frame, dangling awkwardly by the window switch wiring harness. Thomas dropped the flashlight and shoved his hand into the dark, jagged opening. The metal edges of the inner doorframe bit into his knuckles, adding fresh cuts to his already ruined hands. He didn't care. He felt around blindly in the damp, hollow cavity of the door. His fingers brushed against a cold, circular piece of metal, the back of the speaker housing. It was bolted in. 4 small Phillips head screws secured the speaker to the metal frame of the door. Thomas let out a low, ragged sound that was half laugh, half sob. He had practically ripped the door off its hinges, and he was defeated by 4 pieces of cheap, galvanized steel. He pulled his hand out of the door cavity. He looked wildly around the cabin, the beam of the dying flashlight casting erratic, jumping shadows. He needed a screwdriver. He needed a knife. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, the cheap metal car key, the rounded house key to his estate in the Hamptons, the small brass key to his safe deposit box. None of them would work. He looked down at his own clothing. His tie was ruined. His shirt was soaked. Then he looked at his suit jacket. It was a bespoke charcoal 3-piece tailored in Savile Row, the lapel pin. Thomas reached up with clumsy, trembling fingers. He fumbled with the small silver Whitmire Holdings logo pinned to his lapel. The pin itself was thick, made of rigid sterling silver designed not to bend. He yanked it off the fabric, ignoring the small tear it left behind. He gripped the tiny logo between his thumb and forefinger, holding the sharp, rigid pinpoint outward. It was a pathetic, microscopic tool, but it was all he had. He shoved his hand back into the jagged opening of the door panel. He pressed his face against the cracked plastic, shining the flashlight beam into the cavity to see the top screw holding the speaker. He guided the tip of the silver lapel pin into the cross-shaped groove of the screw. He pressed in hard, trying to seat it firmly, and twisted. The pin slipped out, immediately scraping against the metal housing. Thomas repositioned it. He gritted his teeth, pushing his thumb against the back of the pin so hard he felt the metal dig into his own flesh. He twisted again, applying agonizingly slow, sustained pressure. There was a tiny, microscopic pop. The screw turned a fraction of a millimeter. Yes. Thomas breathed, sweat stinging his eyes. Yes. He spent the next 10 minutes working in agonizing, cramped silence. His muscles cramped. The torn nail on his right hand throbbed in time with his racing heartbeat. The cramped angle forced him to contort his wrist painfully, but he kept twisting, using the tiny lapel pin to slowly back the screw out of its threaded housing. Finally, the first screw popped free, falling into the bottom of the door with a metallic clink. He moved to the second. His thumb was bleeding now, sliced open by the edge of the lapel pin, but he couldn't stop. He was operating purely on animal desperation. He worked the second screw out, then the third. By the time he got to the fourth, the speaker was sagging, held only by the bottom corner. He didn't bother unscrewing it. He grabbed the circular edge of the speaker housing, braced his foot against the floorboard, and tore it downward. The metal bracket groaned, bent, and snapped. The speaker came free in his hand, a heavy, solid mass of plastic and metal. Thomas pulled his arm out of the door panel, gasping for air. He dropped the speaker into his lap. It was larger than a hockey puck. The heavy ceramic ring magnet bolted to the back of the paper cone. He stared at it in the dim light of the flashlight. It smelled of old dust and ozone. He had to rip the wires off. He wrapped the thin red and black copper wires around his hand and yanked, snapping them from the terminal. He held the heavy circular magnet in his right hand. It weighed almost a pound. He hesitated. It shuts off all the auxiliary functions. Defaults to a fixed asynchronous pacing. It will feel like you're walking through wet cement. If he did this, the tracking would stop. He would become a ghost again. But he would also be hobbling his own heart. A fixed rate of 65 beats per minute meant his heart could not speed up to compensate for physical exertion. If he ran, he would pass out. If he panicked, his body would demand oxygen that his locked heart simply could not deliver. He would be intentionally crippling his cardiovascular system while being hunted by killers in a remote forest. Thomas looked at the shattered infotainment screen. He looked at the bloody ruins of his hands. There was no choice. He unbuttoned the soaked, ruined collar of his dress shirt. He pulled the fabric aside, exposing the pale skin of his left upper chest. The scar from the implantation was a thin white line slightly raised against his collarbone. Beneath it, the firm rectangular shape of the titanium pacemaker was clearly visible under the skin. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, damp air of the car. He brought the heavy ceramic magnet flat against his chest, pressing it directly over the scar. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical shockwave. A deep, heavy, unnatural thud vibrated through his ribs, so forceful it knocked the breath out of his lungs. Thomas doubled over, dropping the magnet into his lap. He gasped, clutching his chest with both hands. His heart had stopped. For a terrifying, endless 2 seconds, his chest was entirely still. Then the mechanical override kicked in. Thud. It was a slow, heavy, mechanical beat. It didn't feel like a natural heartbeat. It felt like someone had placed a heavy metronome inside his ribcage and set it to a sluggish, unyielding rhythm. Thud. He tried to take a deep breath, his body automatically demanding more oxygen from the shock and the pain, but his heart didn't speed up to accommodate the demand. It remained locked. Thud. A wave of dizzying, sickening vertigo washed over him. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He leaned his head back against the headrest, panting, feeling a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His limbs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if his blood had turned to lead. Thud. 65 beats per minute. Exactly. Unchanging, relentless. Thomas closed his eyes. The pain in his torn hand, the stinging cuts on his knuckles, the cold, wet clothes clinging to his skin, it all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the slow, heavy, artificial rhythm keeping him alive. He reached into his lap with a heavy, uncoordinated arm. He picked up the speaker magnet. He couldn't let it slip. If the magnet moved away from the pacemaker, the safety relay would disengage, the Bluetooth would power back on, and the beacon would broadcast again. He needed to secure it. He fumbled blindly for his ruined suit jacket. He pulled it off, tossing it into the passenger seat. He grabbed his silk tie, which hung loose and wet around his neck. Moving with agonizing slowness, he slid the heavy magnet inside his shirt, positioning it precisely over the surgical scar. He pressed it flat against his skin. Then he wrapped the long silk tie around his chest, over his left shoulder, and under his right arm, binding the magnet tightly against his pectoral muscle. He tied a crude, tight knot over his sternum. He pulled his ruined, bloody shirt closed over the makeshift harness. He was safe. The signal was dead. But as he sat in the dark, trapped in the mud, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and feeling the unnatural, sluggish thud of his own forced heartbeat, Thomas Whitmire realized he had just traded one prison for another. He was a ghost. But he was a ghost trapped in a body that was rapidly failing him. Thud. He looked out the driver's side window into the black, impenetrable forest. He couldn't stay here. When daylight came, a hunter or a logger would find the car. He had to walk. He grabbed the broken, flickering mag light. He reached for the door handle. He pulled it. Nothing happened. Thomas frowned. He pulled harder. The mechanism clicked, but the heavy steel door wouldn't budge. He shoved his shoulder against the door, putting his weight into it. The door moved an inch, then stopped with a heavy, grinding thud. He flashed the dying light out the window. The Taurus hadn't just slid into a rut. The driver's side had careened directly against a massive, fallen oak trunk hidden in the brush. The metal of the door was pinned flush against the solid wood. He was wedged in. Panic flared in his mind, but his heart refused to match it. The disconnect between his terrified brain and his sluggish 65 beats per minute pulse was nauseating. He felt like he was suffocating in slow motion. He turned to the passenger side. He scrambled over the center console, his heavy limbs protesting the awkward movement. He grabbed the passenger door handle and threw his weight against it. The door popped open, swinging wide. Cold, biting wind and a sheet of rain instantly swept into the cabin. Thomas dragged himself out of the car, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mud. The moment he stood upright, the lack of oxygen hit him like a hammer. His vision tunneled. He swayed heavily, bracing a bloody hand against the roof of the Taurus to stay upright. He took a step away from the car into the wet, dark woods. Thud. Every step was a monumental effort. He felt like a deep-sea diver walking in a weighted suit. He had silenced the warning. He had stopped the beacon. But as he looked up at the towering black pines swaying violently in the storm, he knew the hardest part of the night hadn't even begun. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Thomas dragged his right boot out of the sucking mud, the sound a wet, visceral smack in the dark. He planted it forward. Then he waited for his body to authorize the movement of his left leg. Thud. His heart pushed a strictly rationed volume of blood through his veins. It wasn't enough. His thigh muscles screamed burning with a sharp lactic acid fire that usually accompanied a marathon sprint, not a slow, agonizing crawl through the underbrush. He was suffocating in the open air. He gasped, his jaw unhinged, dragging the freezing rain into his lungs, but without an accelerated pulse to transport the oxygen, the air felt useless. Empty. He stumbled over a submerged root, his knees buckling. He hit the forest floor hard, his face slamming into a bed of rotting pine needles and freezing mud. The smell of decay, wet earth fungi, and old wood filled his nostrils. He lay there, the heavy ceramic speaker magnet grinding against his sternum beneath the silk tie. "Just stay down," a treacherous, exhausted voice whispered in the back of his mind. "It's warm in the mud. Just close your eyes." It was a seductive thought. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and liquidated assets with a keystroke was reduced to an animal shivering in the dirt. Surrender would be so quiet. A sharp, unnatural sound sliced through the steady drum of the rain. The heavy clack of a car door shutting. Thomas forced his head up his cheek, peeling away from the mud. Through the dense lattice of pine trunks and briar bushes, maybe 100 yards back down the slope, two beams of brilliant white light cut through the dark. They swept across the dripping foliage, harsh and methodical. They had found the Taurus. "Trunk is clear." A voice carried up the hill, distorted by the wind, but undeniably human, deep, professional. "Driver's side door is wedged." He popped the passenger side. "Check the cabin." A second voice, calmer, deadlier. Thomas pressed his hands flat against the mud and pushed himself up. His arms trembled violently. His vision narrowed to a tight, dark tunnel, the edges blurring with gray static. He needed to climb higher over the ridge, away from the sweeping flashlights. He started moving again, a grotesque, crawling lunge. His wet dress pants snagged on thorns, tearing the expensive wool and slicing shallow cuts into his calves. He didn't feel the pain. His entire nervous system was focused entirely on the crushing weight in his chest. Thud. "Dash is smashed," the deep voice echoed from the bottom of the ravine. "Looks like he took a hammer to the console. Bluetooth module is in pieces." The ping stopped before the car crashed. "Cobb," the calm voice replied. "He didn't just smash the radio, he killed the signal." A beat of silence. Then the calm voice spoke again, closer this time, moving away from the car, moving up the hill. "Look at the door panel." He tore the speaker out. Thomas froze behind the thick trunk of a massive dead oak. He clamped a bloody hand over his mouth to muffle the sound of his ragged, whistling breath. "The magnet," Cobb said, realization dawning. "He tripped the safety relay." "Which means he's locked at base pacing. He can't run. He can barely walk." The beam of a tactical flashlight swept across the tree Thomas was hiding behind, illuminating the rough bark in harsh relief. "Spread out. He's within 200 yards. Look for broken branches, mud disturbances. He's a crippled old man in a storm. Go." The beams separated. One began sweeping to the left, crashing through the brush. The other, Cobb, started climbing straight up the incline, directly toward Thomas. Thomas pressed his spine against the rotting oak. The bark dug through his wet shirt, scraping his skin. He squeezed his eyes shut. The crunch of heavy boots on wet foliage grew louder. The rhythm was steady, unhurried. Cobb didn't need to rush. He knew exactly what he was hunting. Crunch, splash, crunch. Thomas clamped his teeth together to stop them from chattering. The cold was a physical entity now gnawing at his extremities. His fingers were completely numb, curled into stiff, useless claws. 10 yards. The beam of Cobb's flashlight clipped the edge of Thomas's tree, casting a long, distorted shadow into the woods behind him. Thomas could smell him now, a faint odor of gun oil, wet nylon, and peppermint gum cutting through the smell of the pine. 5 yards. Cobb stopped. Thomas stopped breathing entirely. His lungs burned. His locked heart gave a slow, indifferent thud. "I see your tracks, Whitmire," Cobb said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was conversational, intimate. He was standing on the other side of the massive trunk. "You're dragging your right foot. You're exhausted. I get it. The fixed-rate pacing is a nightmare, isn't it? Feels like breathing through a straw." Thomas squeezed his bloody hands into fists. He pressed his knuckles against his forehead. "Miller doesn't want you to suffer." Cobb continued, the beam of his light casually illuminating the brush to Thomas's left. "He just needs the transition of the company assets to go smoothly. If you stay out here, you're going to die of exposure. Your core temp drops, your locked heart won't speed up to generate heat, and you just go to sleep. It's a bad way to go." "He's lying," Thomas thought, the cynical, analytical part of his brain piercing through the panic. "If he wanted me dead by exposure, he'd wait in the car. He needs confirmation. He needs the body." "Step out, Thomas," Cobb coaxed. "Let's get you in a warm car." Cobb took a step around the right side of the tree. Thomas shifted his weight to the left to avoid the sight line. As he moved, his numb frozen fingers brushed against the knot of the silk tie bound across his chest. The wet silk slick with mud and rain slipped. The heavy ceramic magnet shifted. It slid half an inch down his chest, moving off the direct center of the surgical scar. The world exploded. The heavy, sluggish metronome vanished. In its place, Thomas's natural heart rate, fueled by massive pent-up dumps of adrenaline and sheer, unadulterated terror, slammed against his ribs. Thump, 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 thump. It was a machine gun in his chest. 140 beats per minute. Blood roared in his ears. Oxygen flooded his starving brain, a dizzying, euphoric rush of clarity and energy. But with the magnet disengaged, the pacemaker's telemetry awoke. 50 yards away down the hill, a sharp electronic chirp pierced the rain. "I've got a ping," the other hunter yelled. "He's back online directly ahead of you, Cobb, 20 feet. "Got him," Cobb barked. The casual conversational tone vanished. He raised his weapon. Thomas didn't think. The sudden influx of oxygen and adrenaline overrode his exhaustion. He shoved the magnet back up his chest, crushing it against the scar tissue. The brutal shockwave hit him again. The machine gun rhythm stopped, instantly replaced by the crushing, suffocating thud. His knees buckled from the sudden loss of blood pressure, but he didn't fall. He threw his weight away from the tree, launching himself down the steep, slippery embankment on the opposite side of the ridge. He heard the sharp, suppressed phut-phut of a handgun. Bark exploded from the oak tree, right where his head had been a fraction of a second prior. Sharp splinters showered his shoulder. Thomas abandoned all attempts at stealth. He let gravity take him. He slid down the muddy slope on his back, crashing through briars and dead branches, using his legs to deflect off tree trunks. The world was a spinning blur of dark branches and freezing water. He hit the bottom of the ravine in a tangle of limbs splashing into a shallow, icy creek. The water numbed the lacerations on his face. Above him on the ridge, the flashlight beam swept frantically. "Where is he?" Cobb yelled. "Signal lost," the other man shouted back. "He jammed it again." Thomas didn't wait. He rolled over in the freezing water, grabbed a thick root protruding from the creek bank, and hauled himself up. The 65 beats per minute cap immediately demanded payment. His vision grayed out the edges, turning black. He was moving purely on muscle memory and the primal reptilian instinct to survive. He trudged upstream, walking in the center of the creek to hide his tracks, letting the rushing water wash away the mud and blood from his boots. Every step was a silent scream. Time lost all meaning. It wasn't measured in minutes or hours only, in the agonizing interval between one sluggish heartbeat and the next. The rain eventually softened into a miserable, clinging mist. The oppressive blackness of the forest began to thin, diluting into a bruised charcoal gray. Dawn was breaking, stripping away the shadows, but offering no warmth. Thomas dragged himself out of the creek bed. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. They were mechanical appendages, moving only because he demanded it. His bespoke suit was a collection of heavy, mud-caked rags. The blood on his hands had dried into dark, crusty flakes. He pushed through a thick cluster of wet ferns and suddenly violently tripped over something hard and unyielding. He hit the ground, scraping his chin against coarse, wet asphalt. Asphalt! He rolled onto his back, staring up at the pale, bruised sky. He was lying on the shoulder of a 2-lane county road. It was empty, bordered on both sides by the endless pine forest, but it was a road. It meant civilization. A low rhythmic rumble vibrated through the pavement beneath his spine. Thomas turned his head. Half a mile down the straight stretch of road, a pair of dull yellow headlights cut through the morning fog. A logging truck, heavy and slow, grinding its gears as it climbed a slight incline. He forced himself to sit up. The magnet still pressed securely against his chest, bound by the ruined silk tie. He felt a hysterical urge to rip it off, to let his heart race, to finally breathe deeply. But he knew Cobb and the other man were still in the woods behind him. If he pinged now, they would know exactly where to find him. He had to stay locked. Thomas staggered to his feet. He swayed dangerously, stepping out into the center of the right lane. He raised his ruined, bloody arms, waving them slowly above his head. The truck's air horn blasted a deafening, aggressive roar that shook the damp air. The driver slammed on the air brakes. The massive rig hissed and shuddered, tires squealing against the wet asphalt, stopping less than 10 feet from where Thomas stood. The passenger door of the cab swung open. A heavy-set man in a flannel shirt leaned out, his face a mask of shock and anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, buddy?" the trucker yelled over the idling diesel engine. "You trying to get killed?" Thomas didn't speak. He stumbled forward, climbing the metal step of the cab with agonizing slowness. He gripped the door handle with his torn, bloody fingers and pulled himself into the warm, stale interior of the truck. It smelled of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. He collapsed onto the passenger seat, his head rolling back against the headrest. "Hey, you can't just get in here," the driver protested, reaching for a heavy metal tire iron resting on the dashboard. "I'm calling the cops." Thomas moved his left hand slowly. He reached into the dripping, ruined pocket of his trousers. He pulled out the titanium money clip. It was bent, smeared with red clay and dried blood, but the thick fold of crisp $100 bills remained intact. He dropped the clip onto the center console. It hit the plastic with a heavy, authoritative thud. "No cops," Thomas whispered. His voice was completely destroyed, a raspy, guttural scrape of vocal cords. "Drive me to the federal building in Albany. Do not stop. Do not turn on the radio." The trucker stared at the bloody wad of cash. It was more money than he made in 3 months. He looked from the money to the ruined, terrifying apparition of the man sitting in his passenger seat. The man's chest was bound with a filthy silk tie, his skin a sickly, corpse-like gray, but his eyes were entirely lucid. They were cold, calculating, and devoid of any human warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had been pushed to the absolute edge of the abyss and had decided to conquer it. The trucker slowly moved his hand away from the tire iron. He put the massive rig into gear. "Albany," the driver muttered, stepping on the gas. "Whatever you say, mister." The truck lurched forward, picking up speed, leaving the dark, treacherous tree line behind. Thomas closed his eyes. The heater blasted warm air over his frozen skin, but the chill inside him remained untouched. He felt the slow, steady, agonizing thud of his locked heart. He was alive. He had survived the physical hunt. But as he sat in the shaking cab of the logging truck, calculating the exact sequence of legal and financial destruction he was going to unleash upon Miller and his associates, Thomas realized the waitress's warning hadn't just saved his life. It had ended it. The Thomas Whitmire who walked into the Crossroads diner was dead. He had died in the mud, clutching a broken piece of a car speaker to his chest. The man riding in the truck was something else entirely, something hollowed out, something that operated at a cold, fixed, ruthless rhythm. Thud. He kept his hand pressed firmly against the magnet beneath his shirt. He would let them think he was a ghost. He would let them think he was dead in the woods, right up until the moment he tore their world apart. Thud. He took a slow, shallow breath and opened his eyes to the gray morning. Thank you so much for experiencing this dark, intense journey with us. If your heart was pounding as fast as Thomas's was supposed to please, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells us you want more. Gripping, suspenseful stories like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good thriller, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming dramatic tales. Drop a comment below letting us know what you thought of Thomas's desperate escape. See you in the next story.